Buenas tardes a todos. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. My name is Cristel Jusino Diaz. I'm Centro's Director of Research Programs, and I'm really excited to welcome you today to our event, Mapping Puerto Rican Communities, GIS in Action. So this afternoon, we have the wonderful opportunity to speak and learn with and from professionals across diverse sectors about how they use maps as a resource to engage and inform local communities, and how Puerto Ricans in the diaspora and in the archipelago are using maps in innovative ways. To get this conversation started, I'd like to introduce Centro's GIS analyst, Jorge Soldevila Irizarry, who's going to be moderating this conversation and who's going to introduce our esteemed panelists. Jorge.
Gracias, Kristen. Hola a todos. Hi all. Thank you for being here. For those of you who joined and missed the initial video, there is translation available if you click on the little globe icon in the menu bar below. For those of you who are new to Centro, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies is the largest research center and archive dedicated to the Puerto Rican experience. Among other things, we host a number of panels and workshops throughout the year, like the one we're having today. If you're interested in attending other events, we have an upcoming one on June 6 and 7, where we'll be joined by the Diaspora Solidarities Lab for 2 days of critical and thought-provoking conversation. There should be a link to the event in the chat. Yep, there it is. And you can also follow us through social media to stay up to date with upcoming events and activity. As Cristel said, my name is Jorge Soldevila. I am a GIS specialist with the Centro's Data Hub team. We are sort of the more data-driven wing of the broader research cohort here at Centro. And we sort of focus on generating robust research and analysis, and that we communicate to a broader audience, doing reports and dashboards and other digital tools. And we try and make these as palatable as possible and so that people can understand them. And to do that, we tend to use a number of visual tools, say tables, graphs, and maps, which is what gathers us here today. A lot of times when we see maps, we sort of think, they can kind of look confusing because there's a lot of colors and symbols. A lot of them have a lot of things going on at the same time. And we sort of get the sense of what's going on here. But maps are really nothing more than a communication tool. And once we grasp what the colors and symbols mean, they have an enormous capacity of providing context and enriching the stories that we're trying to tell. The panel, as Costera was mentioning, is titled Mapping Puerto Rican Communities, GIS in Action. And for us at the Data Hub, and even before I got here, mapping Puerto Rican community has meant, for the most part, understanding certain spatial patterns of a number of socioeconomic characteristics that describe the Puerto Rican population. We've also done work in the aftermath of hurricanes Irma and Maria, where mapping really became about rebuilding and detailing other aspects happening in Puerto Rico, like closing of schools and other effects that the hurricane had and other government policies. But for many other people, mapping community entails a whole different array of stories and ideas, from community building to climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And for the next hour or so, we're going to have a conversation precisely about that, about the different ideas and stories that Puerto Ricans are trying to tell through maps, to learn from them and to explore how us in our communities can not only share information, but also leverage maps to understand ourselves in the context that surround us. For this panel, we are joined by Maritza Echeverría Ortíz, creator of Where We Were Safe, a project that explores resistance and music. Nicole Hernandez, a Sociocultural Anthropology Ph.D. student at Arizona State University, focusing on Puerto Rican diasporas in California. Rafael Capó, director of Memoria de Colonial, a project that forces us to challenge dominant narratives and rethink spaces of collective memory. And Dr. Maritza Barreto Orta, the principal investigator of Instituto de Investigación y Planificación Costera de Puerto Rico, and whose work on erosion is a must-read for anyone interested in understanding beaches in Puerto Rico. The panel is structured so that each panelist will have between 10 and 15 minutes for our presentation. And after, we'll have a Q&A session. So please use the Q&A chat to drop any questions you may have, and we'll try to answer them as many as possible at the end of the panel. And without further ado, Marcos, if you can kick us off.
Of course. Hello. Okay. Hi, how are you? Really glad to be here. Really glad to share this space with such brilliant minds and amazing projects. And yeah, just like it's a pleasure to share this project and thoughts about mapping communities, resistance, celebration, and so forth. So let's start. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, just like this. Cool. So I guess my approach towards mapping comes from my experience and my background as a journalist and documentary maker. And documentary maker. So this project is called Where We Were Safe. And okay, so Where We Were Safe, it's an ongoing interactive oral history archive that focuses on collecting memories of, sorry about this, I don't know why it's, yeah. So Where We Were Safe, it's an ongoing interactive oral history archive that focuses on collecting memories of the lost and destroyed salsa music places in New York City, such as ballrooms, clubs, record stores, and outdoor venues. And here is when I approach to social mapping or social cartography with oral history. And through these two, I have three objectives. The first one is to reconstruct historical space. You are related to salsa culture and the historical place of salsa culture in New York City. You know that all these spaces are completely disappeared, destroyed, and obliterated. And there is no effort from public institutions, the city, to kind of remember and recover the history of these spaces. So the first objective of the project is to reconstruct the historical space through the memory of the people. The second one is to recover the heritage and the value of the contested spaces. Here it's important to say that space is not important because it just exists or because it's they're like I don't know, like a museum, or there's like building or there is stones. Like place, it's important because of the people. And here it's important to say that the Puerto Rican experience and the Latino experience as a whole in New York City, its history and its experience is really well connected to how they have been used as space and they have contested the space, especially public space. So for me, it was really important to mark the connection between space and how the communities have been used them historically. And the third one, the idea of the project and the map and the archive, it's to create an archive to preserve this story and to make it accessible. As you may know, like salsa is a really well recorded genre. It's really well archived in certain sense. However, it is well connected and is super well registered with its connections with Fania, and especially with thinking about the salseros and the big stars. However, when we think about space, when we think about landmarks of salsa, when we think about all these spaces, the information was really limited. And for that reason, my interest was to map and create and render this map of these spaces that were historical, that has importance, that were importance for the community, importance for the memory, importance for the identity, but were completely obliterated and destroyed. Now I would like to share with you a little bit about the context of the project, why from my research and my interest, place is power, place is important, and why I decided to create this map. Okay, this project started with a question of representation. I'm from Ecuador. I came to the US in 2017. And for the first time in my life, I asked myself, what does it mean to be a Latino? Because when you come from Latin America, the idea of Latinidad and Latino, this term, it's really stern, and you tend to attach to it. But, for the first time, I asked myself, what does it mean to be a Latino in New York City in the 20th century? And obviously, that's when I start to explore these ideas of legacy, the idea of, what's the legacy, sorry, of the Latino community, what's this history, how the Latino community has been used place. And I was just then got interested in how the Latino history is being displayed in the city, how it was shown through public institutions, where the landmarks. And I just started going through this research. And in that research, I found out about Casa Amadeo, this amazing space, this really historical space. And Casa Amadeo is obviously important because it's the first Latino record store in the US. And most importantly, is the oldest record store open and active in the US. For that reason, it's part of the National Register of Historical Places in the United States. And it's also recognized as a New York City landmark. However, when I was going through the research, and when I was interested in maps and interested in how the city displays memory and the history of Puerto Rican history and Latin history, I found out this map that is here. And this map is created by the New York City Landmark Map. It's a New York City Landmark Map, sorry, and it's created by the Landmark Preservation Commission in New York City. And Casa Amadeo is not located and it's not displayed in this map, which, it's probably an error, I don't know. However, I think that this detail is really strong and really represents how tools and how maps has been used against Black and Brown communities and immigrant communities in New York City, because it completely obliterates our connection and our presence in the historical kind of landscape, so there's like an history of obliteration here through maps. So when I start, getting involved, especially in maps, especially in history and how maps has been used in New York City, I found out that, and I understood that maps has been used as tools of oppression, especially traditional cartography. Traditional cartography comes from the legacy of colonization. They were used, to divide communities. They were used to divide land. They were used to resource extraction, to state control. And especially if we put that context in the in the first 50 years, sorry, of the 20th century, we will find a lot of evidence of this. For example, the redlining maps, the urban renewal plans, the slum cleaning maps. They were literally targeting Puerto Ricans, Latinos, and people of color, working class communities, to displace them, to disappear them, and to just like take their land. So, from this approach, I was trying to understand how to reclaim this map, how to reclaim maps. My background comes from media studies, so I was really interested in understanding the meanings of the map as a media. And from that discussion, that's when I was interested in understanding, okay, how we can use maps as resistance. If in the past, and if traditionally maps has been used as tools of oppression, how we can use maps as tools of resistance. And that's when I got interested in social cartography. So my approach, this is when it comes, a little bit about storytelling, a little bit about documentary studies with social cartography. In general, social cartography means, that instead of mapping territories as traditional cartography does, the idea of social cartographies is to map relationships. And I really like this approach because what we are really trying to map in the end of the day, is understanding and trying to find a new way of using cartography. So for example, what I really like in how I use the social cartography lens in this project is because of its collaboration. So social cartography always tries to create maps in community, always tries to be used this tool in which communities, neighborhoods, and families can create their own maps. Also, there's like this idea of agency. So in this idea of agency, it's having our own tools and having the mediums to define what is important to us, to define what places are important to us, what people, what locations. So it's more this idea of how we can reclaim this representation, how we can reclaim our tools to really define what is important to our community, what's important to us. So in this approach, and during the research, I was able to talk to around 25 people. These 25 people were part of the salsa movement of that time. And I was really interested in not interviewing musicians or not interviewing, big salseros. I was really interested in the people that transited through all these spaces, that were part of these spaces. So for example, journalists, photographers, dancers, fans, the bouncer clubs, the managers of the clubs, dishwashers, people that were really behind all these spaces. And for the sake of this project, we define, the places of salsa. And the places of salsa in this project are defined as historical sites, private and public, where not only salsa music was performed, but also where the Latino community needs social dynamics of cultural resistance. So, the backbone of the project, like the core of everything, is to understand how the community and map how the community used these spaces in the 1970s through salsa music to mediate dynamics of resistance, in a way to how they were using these spaces on salsa to confront the violent 1970s. And, in that spirit, I would like to share with you a testimony provided by Mickey Melendez, the young Lord. And his testimony is amazing because he really, I guess his testimony really explains the testament and the spirit of this project. Mickey Melendez was the young Lord that was more related and connected to salsa music. So I found really his testimony really powerful. Give me a second, please. Are you able to see the video or not? Hello?
No.
No? Okay. Let me...
When you're in a barrio, any barrio, you're safe, right? Because everything is okay there. Whatever happens there, you're forgiven. There's a way of talking to people. There's a way of being, of existing in a barrio. Once you step out of a barrio, now you're stepping out into the world, So one way of looking at these spaces that you're talking about is that we created our own little barrios wherever we went to be safe in them. We can talk our language, or the broken Spanish and English that we grew up with, or that we could dance to our music, or that we could make fun at each other, without other eyes looking at us. And that's because we created this barrio. If you define barrio as a safe place where you can be who you are,
Okay, just give me a second here. So, after this, research process, this was, just to close my intervention, sorry, this was the final product, or let's say the final platform, the final map. So in the research, we found more than 100 lot spaces, which only Casa Madeo is the only that exists nowadays. Obviously, it was really hard to just to tell the story of these 100 spaces, but with the community and through research and through the oral interviews and everything, we defined it that to tell the story of these 80 spaces. And these 80 spaces were the most important and were the most present to the community and to the community that I interviewed. And the idea behind this map was just to bring back to life a map that it's only available in the memory of the people, a map that it's only available now in the memory of the community. And the idea with this map, again, was to reclaim that historical place. And if you are more than welcome to enter to the map, it's really extensive. And you just like travel to the map, you will be able to listen to the stories, listen to their testimonies, and so forth. So yeah, I would like to stop there and give space to my colleagues. Hello.
Hello, everybody. My name is Nicole Hernandez. I am so happy to have this opportunity to share about my dissertation research on California Puerto Rican history. Thank you to all the organizers for making this happen, fellow panelists, all the community members. And I'm going to be walking through a lot of the information that goes into my GIS mapping and other mapping formats. I want to say I grew up in East Los Angeles County. fourth generation in Southern California. And I also helped co-found a Puerto Rican association in Los Angeles in 2016. And I take all of those identities really seriously in my work. And I want to start today with this. Here we go. The list of critical manuscripts, oral history projects, articles about specifically California, Puerto Rican history. They range from psychology, the geography, sociology, linguistics, political science, really covers a broad range of materials. Here I'm contextualizing the early environment Puerto Ricans who are coming from Hawaii back to the San Francisco city, find themselves in. All of the newspapers of the day from San Francisco to Los Angeles are really describing Puerto Ricans and their neighborhoods as disease-ridden, as unsanitary, condemned, public health threats, and places where there's lots of violence. So this is the environment that our earliest known organizations are organizing through practices of mutual aid that they brought with them from Puerto Rico to Hawaii to California to create some of the longest lasting Puerto Rican organizations in the country. This is a slimmed down list of Puerto Ricans in California. You have in 1850, Simon Meses, who is born and raised in Puerto Rico, a bilingual lawyer, and he comes to California and starts defending California land grant families to help them withhold their land. He winds up owning close to 6,000 acres, and from that he creates what we now know today as Redwood City. We have at the bottom Felicita and Sylvia Mendez. Felicita's family comes to California, Southern California, by way of Arizona and now Rabo, and they are really infamous in the state for helping desegregate California state schools through a lawsuit in the 40s that they undertake with a collective of other farm labor families in Southern California. Then you have Alba Montes and David Santiago, two individuals from Ponce, who are organizing specifically for Alba in the Mission District of San Francisco, a very concentrated neighborhood of concentrated Latinos, but also Puerto Ricans. David Santiago is probably the most important Puerto Rican political organizer in Los Angeles history. He is part of every Latino organization at the time. He's helping get Mexican Americans elected to office. He's also creating the largest Puerto Rican celebration, probably outside of New York at the time. And then the Calderon family in the top right is actually from Vieques, and they also come to California by way of Arizona. And they are very well known in the city still today. Their descendants live there, and they are creating, they're part and parcel of the civic fabric of Oakland, part of creating organizations that still service the Latino community today. Here's an overview of monuments, memorials, murals across the state. We have, of course, Simon Meses honored in Redwood City. We have the Mendez family honored across the state. We have Orlando Cepeda, player of the San Francisco Giants from the late 50s to mid 60s. We have a World War II monument in Union City, erected in the 40s by the members of the Puerto Rican Union of Mutual Aid, an organization still around today. We have murals from San Francisco, San Diego, and the bottom left is an elementary school named for Carmen Melendez, who helped create the first dual immersion language program in the Fremont Unified School District. So for me, the 70s is sort of peak Puerto Rican political advocacy. You have at the same time the Western Region Council in the Bay Area led by Isidoro Calderon, Jorge Piñero, and others. And they're creating a network of Puerto Ricans across the state that include the likes of David Santiago in Los Angeles, who's running his own newspaper in the 60s, Angie Echeverría, who's in the center of the image here, who's organizing with him sort of elite circles of Puerto Ricans in Hollywood, etc. And then, of course, their Dia de San Juan Festival, which in the 70s is peaking at 40 to 60,000 people. so much that they're being recognized by LA City and the state legislature, and which they're proclaiming this week as Puerto Rican Week in the state. You have, of course, the Puerto Rican Socialist Party with chapters in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And I want to point out these two reports, they're state reports. One is 1977 by the Lieutenant Governor's Office. And this is a community-driven census which Jorge Piñero oversees. And he reports that Puerto Ricans in this year are up to 350,000 in the state. The report admits that this is probably a slight overcount, but is far more accurate than the US Census. And so the work of all of these individuals really collide to make this particular United States Commission Civil Rights Report possible. It's called Puerto Ricans in California. It's available online. And it is a really great overview of all of their concerns, the needs that they see that are not being addressed by social services that are available for other Puerto Ricans in the area. And they're doing a lot of the work during these decades to get extra support for the work that they're doing, but they're being turned down across the board at every level of government, unfortunately. So I'm doing a lot of work in this slide, but the point for me was to show how Puerto Rican identity, music, food, etc., is changed by the immigration to Hawaii, and of which then comes to California. And so you have in the greater San Francisco Bay Area, multiple clubs founded by these individuals. And this identity is so rooted in them that just last year, they hosted a very successful fundraiser for the Lahaina fires in Maui. And they directed this funding through the Maui Puerto Rican Association, which is the last remaining 501c3 in the state. They have their own building, and you can go to their website and donate to this. It's going to a lot of Puerto Rican people of Puerto Rican heritage who did lose their belongings in Lahaina. And just quickly to note that it was also Ruben Gomez and Orlando Cepeda playing for the Giants during these years. And baseball was integral social activity for Puerto Ricans. They were active. These are newspaper clippings from the 30s. They were active all over the greater Bay Area, but also in specifically Hawaiian leagues. Here we have the most cohesive account for all of the Puerto Rican organizations across the state. As you can see, they're really in every single city or region. It's a mistake to say that there were no Puerto Rican neighborhoods in California, historically or today. That's actually untrue. And I want to point out that active still today are the two oldest Puerto associations in the state. The Puerto Ricans Club in San Francisco is actually the oldest incorporated institution in the United States for Puerto Ricans and Latinos. And I want to point out towards the bottom, the Afro-Latino Education Arts Collective and the Boricuas Unidos, Inc. These are two organizations created by Puerto Ricans that grow up in Bakersfield. Another area we might not realize was a concentration of Puerto Ricans as well. The Afro-Latino Education Initiative is actually a prima of mine who, as a Black Puerto Rican woman, just really wanted to take it upon herself to create a space that's a little more welcoming for other Black Puerto Ricans and people across the Americas. And so this is more of my mapping at its core. And I feed a lot of this work with all the information I previously showed. And I'm really looking at where, how populations are moving in the state, they're increasing, decreasing, and mapping, social institutions, entities, along with individual residency patterns. And as you can see in the middle, sort of the spatial distribution of Puerto Ricans are such that it's especially historically was pretty much impossible for the census to capture. And so that is what a lot of the older organizers are really trying to sum up and call attention to in their respective efforts. So I'm happy to talk about more of this later. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. And thank you, Marcos. That was a very interesting, a lot of connections with my own project that I'm going to be presenting now. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Centro, for hosting and for supporting my project, Memoria Colonial, and particularly to Cristel Jusino, who opened us up. Hopefully you can see my presentation there. I am the director of Memoria Colonial, a nonprofit organization that rethinks cultural heritage in Puerto Rico from a decolonial lens. And before I get into our map and our project, I want to share a bit about how I got interested in maps. And this is a map that a lot of us who grew up in Puerto Rico would find at a restaurant. It's a placemat that was very common throughout the island. And I loved playing around with this map, connecting the dots, doodling. You see that airplane on the top. I love to imagine where that plane was coming from, who was on board. Was it leaving Puerto Rico? Were there Puerto Ricans leaving somewhere else? Why were they leaving? Were they perhaps coming back? There's a lot of tourist symbology there, which I also found very interesting. And I also was very much into video games. And I remember most of the games I played had maps in them, and they were used to sort of consume the world, to conquer the world, to dominate the world, to extract its resources. And when I saw maps on school textbooks, history was my favorite discipline. I also started realizing how these maps were part of how the Western world consumed, extracted, and came to dominate the Americas, the Caribbean. And these maps, for instance, I always focused on these ships, like what were they taking? What were they bringing in, right? And a lot of questions about the iconography, the symbols used. Always found it interesting. And also the political borders, right? What was a French, why were the French this color and the British were this color? And that then brings me to this map, which is a very common map used in Puerto Rico. It's the one given to tourists when they arrive in San Juan. It's the official company of tourism map. And as you can see, it lays out Old San Juan pretty clearly, its sites for you to visit. But when you look at La Perla, a historically marginalized community, it's empty, right? It's a terra nullis. There's nothing there for you to visit. And on one side, you could argue that a counter mapping project would try to fill this empty land with, you know, a counter map that demonstrates everything that this land has to show, to invite tourists. But I also heed caution to that, because maps as tools of extraction, we must be very careful that even when we have good intentions, right? Maps that are that visibilize vulnerable communities also lay them out for consumption. They make them more vulnerable. So that's all something I've always thought about when developing, as Marcos was talking about, social cartography. Be very careful with what we present on that map, because others can use it for purposes that are not rooted in social justice. I think about maps with this concept of unmapping, or desmapear, which I first read in a paper by Dr. Tauli Goff. She defines it as, if mapping is about knowing and surveying, then unmapping is about unknowing and uncharting the territory. To welcome not knowing allows one to be receptive to other forms of knowledge. And so I think about unmapping as sort of pushing against the Cartesian obsession of maps. What happens when we think about a map beyond geographic space, right? What happens when we think about mapping and cartography beyond locating where something is? And it brought me to think about many forms of unmapping in terms of mapping as process, history, canvas, relation. I'm not going to go into detail into all of these, but I do want to share the work of Dominican American artist Fidelay Baez, and her work where she paints on top of colonial maps. And this one, she presents La Ciguapa, which is a folkloric beast or creature in Dominican society that sort of challenges gender norms. She walks with her feet reversed, which is makes her really hard to trace. And she was told, Fidile bias from a very young age, that be careful not to be too promiscuous or to be in certain ways, because you're going to be like a ciguapa. And Fidile found that ciguapa to be a very much generative space to inhabit, right? The uncharted, the unchartable, if you will, right? And that's where I'm thinking about maps in sort of that direction, and thinking about maps as relation. And this is very connected to what Marco was saying about maps as sort of demonstrating relationships. And if we push back against political maps, that all they show are boundaries, man-made, human-made boundaries. Let's think about maps. For instance, this one shows the connections between Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, the connection, as Brathwaite would say, the unity is submarine. It's valleys and mountains that are submerged underwater, but we're all connected in the Caribbean region. And these geographic nautical maps help reflect those connections. And it also helps us see that, for instance, our biodiversity are very much connected. The coqui churri, the coqui pitito. Everyone thinks the coqui, right, is only Puerto Rican. It's not. Coquis don't know political boundaries, right? The coqui, these two coquis are native to the Virgin Islands as well. So that brings us closer together with these islands that colonialism and imperialism have created these artificial boundaries. With that said, the mangrove as this sort of ecosystem that brings us all together, that connects us all together, is also, and maybe perhaps Maritza will touch on that, but thinking about the mangrove as sort of this interconnected landscape that brings the Caribbean region together is also a way of thinking of mapping as relation. So with that said, I'd like to show specifically our map. You can visit on memoriadecolonial.com. I'm going to share that here for everyone. Here you go. And you can, it's right on the landing page. I prefer to explore the map. If you hit see full screen, it'll take you to the platform that we use for mapping. We don't use GIS, we use UMap, which is an open source and open access platform, which is great for collaborative mapping. Many people can map at the same time. It's wonderful. So this project is my pandemic project. It was my pandemic project. It was my way of sort of, I got really interested in monuments, particularly because of the Black Lives Matter movement. I looked for parallels in Puerto Rico. And while we don't really have, although there was a Confederate monument, or at least a building at one point, we don't really have that history of Civil War and the Confederacy. We do have an interesting relationship to Spain and Eurocentrism and that Hispanic legacy, which I was always really drawn to studying critically. And understanding monuments as statements of power, as the Arts Collective Monument Lab defines it. It's very interesting to see the stories and the narratives that monuments not only tell, but that they reinforce in society. There's an intentionality of a monument, of a plaque, right? It's what the government, what the state wants you to know, think, and believe about a certain history or a certain site or a certain person, right? So understood through a decolonial lens, I decided that from the very beginning that I wasn't going to look at monuments from a decolonization standpoint that centered political forms of decolonization. Why? Because if I were to focus on the idea of establishing the Puerto Rican Republic, or for others, establishing statehood, this map would be littered and just like full, and it would just be saturated because everyone has a perspective on that, right? I found it more generative, more interesting to explore how colonialism, its legacies, its hierarchies of race, gender, sexuality, religion, how those have been reinforced and how those are remembered and preserved through the commemorative landscape. So if you play around with the map, I prefer to go down here and browse data. You can sort of hide the different layers. And so the first layer that I was interested in, I'm going to hide the different layers so we can just see the Spain one. Obviously, these are the monuments. If you go into these, you can find, right, this is more of an archive of, for instance, statues to Juan Ponce de Leon. You have the Christopher Columbus statue as well, different pictures that I took, and also information, archival information that we're bringing in, and that's still a work in progress. We're always adding to this. But I always found interesting how Eurocentrism and Hispanophilia sort of seeped in to the Puerto Rican imaginary and its cultural heritage. We have monuments to the Taínos, for instance. I'm going to open that label, that capa, that layer. You have monuments which are I'm not going to say my favorite, but the ones I find most interesting, monuments to mestizaje, the narrative of the three races. And I share here, for instance, this one by José Buscaglia Guillermetti, a sculptor from Puerto Rico, where he presents the African child, the indigenous woman, and Juan Ponce de Leon in the middle, sort of sustaining the racial triad that has been used in Puerto Rico to suggest, right, that we have always been a racial democracy where racism hasn't existed. And so these narratives of racial democracy, of mestizaje, are very, very much present in the commemorative landscape in Puerto Rico. You can find those in that category. But what really surprised me in this project was finding out all the monuments to war. And this is I'm going to show you the layer. All these green dots are monuments specifically dedicated to veterans, dedicated to veterans of different conflicts. The most that stands out is the Korean War. And the words that I find most frequently deployed, let's go to Yauco. We have 3 monuments to war, to veterans in Yauco. This is a pretty interesting one, given that it's a sort of a Rambo figure with a Vietnamese child. He's protecting the child. And it's very interesting to see how these mayors, particularly, right, elected officials, decide to commemorate these war heroes for them. And the words democracy and liberty were the most frequently deployed in the plaques in these monuments. So that's also an interesting sort of segue or for I'm interested in this map to be used for scholars, researchers, and we're going to continue to add on to it. We're going to keep adding context, turn it into an archive, and we're elaborating a story map currently about the monuments to mestizaje and the racial triad. So yeah, there's also monuments, obviously, to the US that are very interesting, but I don't want to take any more time. So I invite you all to explore the map and dig into the pictures. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the Q&A. Thank you.
A todos, a todes, un saludo muy grande desde Puerto Rico y especialmente un saludo de parte del Instituto, los que somos parte del Instituto de Investigación y Planificación Costera de Puerto Rico, que está adscrito a la Escuela Graduada de Planificación del recinto de Río Piedras de la Universidad de Puerto Rico. Para mí es un gran honor, ¿verdad?, ser parte de este conversatorio sobre el uso de los mapas y presentarle cuál ha sido la experiencia de nosotros en Puerto Rico, especialmente luego del escenario del paso de los huracanes Fiona, María, Irma y también de los eventos de los terremotos. En el día de hoy les quiero compartir sobre una de las herramientas que hemos estado utilizando nosotros en la universidad, una herramienta espacial, un web map o un mapa virtual para poder entender los cambios costeros en Puerto Rico. Y es interesante porque ustedes saben que los cambios costeros, especialmente cuando hablamos de erosión costera, es un tema, ¿verdad?, que está extensamente discutido, no solamente en la academia, sino a través de las comunidades, a través de los medios, y cada día sigue, ¿verdad?, teniendo la necesidad de tener más datos e información para poder informar correctamente sobre ese estado. A partir de ahí es que nace esta iniciativa de hacer mapas para entender la erosión costera y entender los cambios costeros, porque cuando estábamos trabajando en la universidad nos dábamos cuenta de que realmente por más que queríamos visitar, ¿verdad? O tener mucha información disponible para todo tipo de participante o público, era muy difícil. Es de ahí entonces que surge de la idea de generar, utilizando sistemas de información geográfica y teledetección, una herramienta que fuera fácil de utilizar para todos. Ahora, quiero compartir, vamos a ver si me pasa la próxima. Ok, pero antes de hablarles un poquito de lo que es el mapa, quiero compartir o hablarles sobre algunos retos que nosotros tenemos acá en Puerto Rico, que ha ayudado, ¿verdad?, en el término de usar herramientas para poder enfrentar esos espacios que estos retos nos están trayendo. Uno de estos retos, sabemos que la erosión costera ha estado presente en Puerto Rico por más de 3 décadas. Hemos encontrado también que a partir del 2012, la erosión costera ha incrementado de una manera importante en muchas áreas en Puerto Rico. Zonas como Loíza, San Juan, en la zona de, por ejemplo, Aguadilla, Arecibo, han generado unos nuevos eventos de erosión y sumamente rápido que están creando problemas en términos de la infraestructura y yo les diría también en términos de las comunidades que allí viven. Otro reto muy importante es que aproximadamente, basado en el censo del 2020, 22% de la población de Puerto Rico está localizada en una franja de baja elevación que si se compara respecto al nivel del mar hasta 10 metros, que hace que estén expuestos a eventos como son las inundaciones costeras. Aproximadamente 13% de la población de Puerto Rico en el 2020 está localizada también en esta franja. Otro reto muy importante es la ubicación de la infraestructura crítica del país. Por ejemplo, zonas como hospitales, escuelas, generadores de energía eléctrica, entre otros, están localizados aproximadamente un 32%, ¿verdad?, de esa infraestructura crítica está en esa franja de exposición a estas inundaciones costeras. Y otro reto también muy importante es que sí existe información sobre los cambios costeros, sin embargo, los cambios son tan rápidos que se nos hace difícil tener revisiones constantes de los mismos. Y diciendo esto, ¿por qué es tan importante saber dónde está la erosión costera, cuál es la distribución espacial y usar los mapas para poder presentar, ¿verdad?, estos problemas? Y es, si ustedes observan, ¿verdad?, la primera, quiero que observen esta casa que está localizada en la zona de La Boca en Barceloneta, y esto es una imagen que fue tomada antes del paso del huracán María en enero de 2017. La distancia que hay entre la casa y la línea de costa es aproximadamente unos 70 metros. Luego del paso del huracán María, que es la segunda fotografía, vean la misma casa que el huracán María redujo el ancho de playa. En otras palabras, hay erosión costera y entonces la casa solamente tenía apenas unos 30 o 25 metros a la línea de agua. Teniendo entonces un área mucho más expuesta, tenemos esta foto donde voy a presentar rapidito este video, donde vemos que en un evento de marejadas, y quiero que observen exactamente aquí, de marejadas de primavera en marzo, esa misma casa fue impactada entonces por lo que es la marejada de Riley. ¿Por qué? Porque ya no tenía una costa o una playa que protegiera del embate de ese oleaje. Así que en abril de 2018 pueden ver estas imágenes aéreas donde esa misma infraestructura ya prácticamente estaba en el agua. Diciendo esto, entonces, es que vemos la importancia de por qué tenemos que generar datos e información para enseñar los cambios costeros en Puerto Rico y especialmente identificar esas zonas de erosión costera para planificar y de manera proactiva poder hacer manejo de riesgo y poder, ¿verdad?, preparar todas estas comunidades y que esta infraestructura sea afectada lo menos posible por estos eventos. Es de ahí entonces que generamos y diseñamos un mapa y un banco de datos que nos permitiera no solamente identificar esas zonas costeras, sino también generar unas características especiales que apoyara los procesos de planificación costero en Puerto Rico, que dicho sea de paso, durante muchos años han sido zonas grises o zonas donde no hemos tenido un plan integrado para lo que es el manejo de erosión de costa, que lo que ha producido es que no se ha realmente manejado correctamente en las pasadas décadas. Y esto nos ha hecho en estos momentos, especialmente ante las manifestaciones del cambio climático, que entonces estemos mucho más vulnerables que antes. En términos generales, lo que hacemos es que tomamos fotografías aéreas de alta resolución. Aquí tenemos ejemplos de 3 periodos de la zona de la Boca de Barceloneta, a través de una serie de protocolos definidos en el laboratorio y en conjuntos a nuestros estudiantes de la Escuela Graduada de Planificación, comenzamos a extraer los diferentes componentes de la costa, como la línea de costa, la zona detrás de la playa, entre otros componentes. Diseñamos una serie de dominios para generar este banco de datos que, más allá de extraer la imagen o el componente de la imagen, podamos añadir información adicional, que esto incluye hasta datos de viajes de campo. Aquí tenemos un ejemplo en términos de la línea de costa. Tenemos una imagen base de la zona de Barceloneta y vemos diferentes colores de diferentes líneas de costa a través de los años. Así que demuestra, ¿verdad?, cuán rápido está cambiando esta posición de línea de agua en muchas zonas de Puerto Rico. Finalmente, podemos representar esos cambios a través de una serie de simbología, que en este caso las líneas verdes lo que significa son zonas de ganancias de sedimento y las líneas rojas son zonas de erosión. En términos generales, generamos un banco de datos con aproximadamente 21 capas de información y pueden mirar aquí en la imagen. Esto no es una imagen vertical, es una imagen oblicua, o sea que es para que ustedes puedan ver los componentes, pero para un ejemplo extraemos o digitalizamos lo que es la línea de costa, la zona detrás de la playa, pero también caracterizamos si estas, por ejemplo, la línea detrás de la playa tiene estructura, tiene dunas, tiene vegetación, o en el caso de la línea de costa, si está protegida por barreras, por corales, hierbas marinas, entre otros. Esto nos permite poder hacer un análisis geoespacial, ¿verdad?, de manera más detallada, con una precisión de prácticamente de 0.2 metros, que nos ayuda a poder, ¿verdad?, recomendar cursos de acción para poder reducir la erosión en muchas áreas. Aquí hay un ejemplo y le incluyo el QR code para que ustedes lo pueden compartir, lo pueden leer, y ahí les va a accesar al producto del webmap que actualmente llevamos 2 años publicado en línea y que actualmente aproximadamente 50,000 personas de alguna otra manera, ¿verdad?, han podido utilizarlo con diversos propósitos. En el mapa, como les dije, tiene 21 capas de información. Entre ellos están los tipos de costa, si la costa es playa, manglar, si es costa rocosa o si es costa aluvial. Además de eso, si la persona quiere desplegar las líneas de costa solamente en las zonas detrás de la playa, y ustedes dicen, ¿para qué es importante la línea detrás de la playa? Pues nos permite ver, por ejemplo, si la playa, especialmente ante las manifestaciones del aumento del nivel del mar, si esa playa está migrando tierra adentro o si no lo está haciendo. Así que hay muchos tipos de análisis que realmente podemos hacer. Uno de los análisis bien interesantes es el que enseña este mapa, donde nosotros extraímos la posición de todas las estructuras duras de mitigación que se han hecho en Puerto Rico a través del tiempo. Y esto nos ayuda a evaluar cuál ha sido el rol de estas estructuras duras en términos de promover más erosión en otras áreas costeras. Aquí tenemos otro ejemplo de este webmap, y lo importante de este tipo de webmap, que más allá de poder desplegar las diversas combinaciones entre las 21 capas, usted puede también desplegar diferentes mapas bases, ya sea con imágenes o ya sea con mapas políticos, de acuerdo al interés y la pregunta de investigación o el deseo de lo que usted quiera realmente buscar dentro del mapa. También le permite el mapa poder, con un estilo tipo Google Earth, que puede entonces a través de este buscador escribir el área interesada y con una precisión de 0.2 metros, porque estamos hablando que son imágenes de alta resolución, podemos entonces especificar o identificar el área en interés. Una de las ventajas de este tipo de web map es que ahora mismo nosotros tenemos datos de la información después de Fiona, después del huracán María. No nos gustaría que vinieran más eventos, pero nuestra realidad es esa, ¿verdad? Que sí van a venir. Así que nosotros podemos seguir construyendo más capas que nos puedan entonces llevar a hacer un análisis más profundo sobre lo que son los impactos de los huracanes e inclusive los impactos del uso de terreno sobre el territorio de Puerto Rico. Aquí tenemos un ejemplo de lo que sería uno de los productos. Realmente tenemos un producto, tenemos 44 story map o componentes explicando las diferentes capas por municipio y además tenemos un análisis a nivel de toda la isla. Este ejemplo, por ejemplo, este mapa le puede presentar, por ejemplo, en el caso de la migración de la línea de agua, o sea, cómo la línea de agua se está moviendo hacia tierra adentro. Ya para el 2018, 98 kilómetros de la isla de Puerto Rico, secciones de la costa, se están moviendo tierra adentro. Esto nos ayuda entonces a planificar que en los próximos eventos de este año, ya esas son las primeras zonas que tenemos que levantar banderas porque podrían ser las más afectadas por erosión costera e inundaciones. En términos de lo que sería los favor y en contra, pues mire, quizás la dificultad de tener este tipo de mapa, y es algo que nos hemos identificado, es que para algunos casos vamos a tener lo que yo llamo come back to the basic. Hay una realidad, hay una población o un sector de la población de Puerto Rico que no maneja este tipo de web map o estas herramientas digitales, y lo que estamos haciendo es preparando, ¿verdad?, de manera impresa este tipo de análisis para llevarlo. Sin embargo, en términos de lo que es llegar a poblaciones, no solamente en Puerto Rico, a nivel mundial, pues es muy accesible. Y esto es, lo hemos visto, ¿verdad? En los pasados meses, nosotros, especialmente este web map, que fue realizado por un grupo de estudiantes de la Escuela Graduada de Planificación, fue a la competencia, una competencia mundial, y ganó uno de los premios por uno de las herramientas geoespaciales que da información y llega a las comunidades. Sabemos que aunque no sabemos todo el perfil de quién lo ha usado, sabemos que muchos de los municipios, muchos de los grupos, las organizaciones no gubernamentales como líderes comunitarios han utilizado estas herramientas para poder buscar, por ejemplo, ayuda o por lo menos preparar planes para manejo de la erosión costera de su área. A continuación, tienen algunos de los QR codes de los productos. Les invito a que los visiten y que si tienen alguna pregunta de ellos, con mucho gusto estamos abiertos para todas las preguntas que tengan. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, everybody. Gracias, Maritza. Thank you, Rafa. Thank you, Nicole. And thank you, Marcos. These have been wonderful presentations. I thoroughly enjoyed being able to sit down and talk about maps and how we communicate with them and the ways that we can challenge certain narratives and whatnot. And to that point, let me just do a small mea culpa here. Here, because us at Centro, for the most part, we use a licensed software to do a lot of our mapping and GIS work, and that's partly also my fault that we've continued to do this. And these are things that are generally not accessible to the public and that are available to us through other formats and systems that a lot of times might be problematic in some way or whatnot. And never mind the fact that me being a GIS specialist, a lot of the techniques that I use were initially developed for war purposes and whatnot. It would not surprise anybody if some of the techniques that we use to do mapping are currently being used to target Palestinians by the Israeli military forces. So there is a part of that that we're always reckoning with when we're doing maps and we're doing GIS work, and that's always something that we should highlight and think about. I certainly try and think about it when I'm doing work and when I was coming up and studying and whatnot. And yeah, let me just also clarify one thing, because Maritza was talking about the water line, and or just for those of you who might not know, the water line is sort of like the shaded part of when the waves come into the sand, and the part that ends up being wet, that you can actually take pictures and draw those lines. And that is what in Maritza's world, and I do not know oceanography, something like that might be the translation. It's called the water line. And we have a Q&A chat that it's already open, and there's a few questions, and I'll go through them in a bit. I just wanted to kick it off because part of the event that when we organized it, we were talking, and Maritza pointed to this at the end. We discussed, and sort of the hope of it was to also bring forth this concept or this idea that digital literacy is important and is something to be developed in our communities, and sort of making information accessible, which is something that all of us are doing. Nicole's work, for a lot of us, like, has communities of Puerto Ricans beyond the traditional Pennsylvania, New York, Chicago, are sort of mysterious in some way, and try and make, and for Marcos, recapturing this past spaces where Puerto Ricans felt safe in New York, and what today might not be that. I've been to Toñitas multiple times in my time here in New York, and my first experience was, I was hoping this would be like a safe haven for me, just as a Puerto Rican, to feel Puerto Rican. And when I got there, it was like, oh, the couple Venezuelans and Mexican friends that have been there just feel as home as much as I do there. So am I Puerto Rican? Am I Latino? There's like debates of who I am as I enter a place that I expected to be something else. And in your work also, there's an aspect of democratizing information. And I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit more of like, what impact do you expect from your work in that aspect, and how important you think it is that your work is made using tools that are available to the public. I mean, in Marco's work, and in Rafa's also, using open source software or other types of democratizing information in that way. If any of you have any comments about it.
¿Puedo empezar yo acá, Maritza?
Yes.
Sí, definitivamente el uso de las herramientas de sistemas de información geográfica. Nosotros no estamos usando un open source, pero sí estamos ahora en la línea de movernos a esto, porque sabemos que no todo el mundo, ¿verdad?, puede tener la oportunidad de tener un programa con licencia, ¿verdad?, no abierta. Pero sabemos que la información que generamos y la experiencia de tener el web map, y como había comentado, entendemos que ya van como cerca de los 50,000 personas han visitado el web map, y nos han dicho que los datos de información han sido positivos, especialmente en el proceso de reconstrucción de Puerto Rico, especialmente también las comunidades para apoderarse. Yo creo que el tener datos e información da más poder a las comunidades, da más oportunidades para ellos mismos ir a los distintos foros, a la legislatura, para poder hablar y pedir sobre los derechos y sus espacios necesarios para su bienestar. Así que yo entiendo, basado en lo que he hablado con varios líderes y lideresas, que ese ha sido uno del impacto de este tipo de web map, pero entendemos todavía que necesitamos trabajar con la comunidad de personas mayores, como decía anteriormente, que no manejan este tipo de herramientas, y estamos tratando de diseñar, todavía no sabemos qué, pero estamos en esa, con el propósito de poder llegar también a estas comunidades.
We have the same approach. We try and, when we do our maps, try and add download buttons, and so that people can access the information that was already provided in whatever tool we create. So as a way of, if you cannot access it through here or whatever, you can also use download it and manipulate it and use it as you want. Yeah.
I can hop in. In my case, I think that it's more about how I activate the Oral History Archive and how activate the map. Because, like the map can be overwhelming for different people at the same time. So for example, in my case, it's also thinking about how the map and how the project can be conceived and experienced as a transmedia project. And by transmedia, I mean that how different communities and different ages among this community can access it and can interpret it and can read it. So in that effort, for me, for example, it's really hard for, I don't know, for someone old to get access to my map or to where we were saved map or to understand it, So in that sense, thinking about this accessibility to the map, we also decided to do like a physical publication of the map to think about that community, and to think about how community can activate and how can connect with that project. And also for me, I think it's also, since, we are dealing with digital medium and we're dealing with communities in the digital realm and so forth, for me, it's also important to think, how we can create community spaces and physical spaces. So in that sense, it's also thinking about how the archive and how the map can activate that. And in the efforts and in the spirit of that, we have done public screenings and in which, like community can go to these spaces, we can activate and we can see the map together. And that has been enormously important because it has generated intergenerational conversations and intergenerational relationships. So for example, young Latinos or Latinx, 20, 23 years old, they have come with their tias or with their grandparents or with their parents, to these events. And it's interesting, how that event and how the map have spurred like different oral histories among their own families. So, in my case, it's just thinking about, not just the tool as a digital accessibility, but also, how you can translate these maps or these tools in order to have like a more physical and community approach to them.
Absolutely. I did see there's a couple of, yes, sorry, Nicole.
I'll just
Go,
pick
go.
up
No
a
worries.
little bit on that because I see using these tools as a way to give back to these organizations which have been around for over a century, to reflect to them how important their internal archives are and their extended like home archives of all the collective members. And so it's a really tool to empower them to start thinking about their history in a broader way and connect it regionally across the Southwest, the Pacific, and the East Coast. And so I think it's a really strong tool.
It is. At some moment I might email you actually, because we're working on a project that has to do with Puerto Rico's in 1950s, and I would like to hear your insight about it. I did see some questions in the Q&A. If you're interested in particular slides or something that was highlighted in one of the presentations, please, if you follow our social media, like Centro's social media accounts, we will update when the recordings of the presentation are made available, and you can follow them there. I think it's an easier, it should not take that long, and it's a lot easier than having us go back to the presentation and maybe highlighting some aspects of it, because we have about 6 or 7 more minutes before the panel ends. And there's some very interesting questions in the chat that I really want to get to. There's one that was already answered, but Nicole, if you would just like to repeat, Erika Abad, I think it's Dr. Erika Abad, if that's the person I'm thinking of, asked that question about it, particularly to Nicole, and it said, how do you see mapping Boricuas across what is now California and Hawaii? And can you expand on what we know of Boricuas in traditional regions? And I really liked your response. So
yeah,
if you could highlight it again, so
yeah, definitely.
people.
I think for me, getting down to sort of the spatial distribution of these communities is one of the strongest ways we can expand, because people do localize how they are moving into the Southern California in ways that counter their experiences in New York City and Chicago. There's also ways that how being that there's Puerto Ricans are kind of skirting a lot of government policies, you know, in the early 20th century, how their practices of mutual aid and other sort of resistance works in those communities, and also the racialization process can all come through and expand on what we know in these other regions.
Yeah, and there's another question from Erika to Marcos. And they ask, how does mapping the role of music in our past safety, I'm guessing like relates to safety, and then sort of like in terms of future research, how do we think sonic safety fits beyond the memory of the people who built it or with each other?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to what Nicole says, you know, that's important, you know, the idea of community archives and how we use these tools to empower the communities. So I guess, you know, it's also thinking about who's the gatekeepers of this history and who is going to maintain these stories and available for whom. So in that sense, you know, I think this is still, especially in my project, thinking about what's the future of it and how we can navigate those relationships. Because when you think about another history archive, it's always thinking about who's going to take care of it for the next 100 years, you know? So thinking about it, it's like, I guess it's important to mediate and to think about new ways in which the community can maintain them, activate them, and manage them, you know? So in that sense, you know, it's probably important to think about in every single step of the mapping of the distribution or wherever, like thinking about, you know, the necessities of the community and how they can, you know, manage their own past. And I guess, you know, thinking about community archives, that's kind of like one answer to it.
Yeah, I was in your answer, I was sort of evoked the work that there's been a couple work on community gardens also in New York City, sort of also that became spaces of safety and for community to get and sort of they've been lost throughout time, and there's only really a couple now that really are own and sort of emblematic of their Puerto Ricanness and the heritage of Puerto Rico. So it's definitely an obstacle to sort of keep that in sort of in our hands also to continue and keep safe and maintain these spaces that are that allow us to be in community with ourselves. There was a question. Oh, is it answered? I believe so. I'll go to the ones that are not answered.
There's a question that I think I clicked that I wanted to answer about Aguadilla specifically.
Yes, I was just about to get to that one.
Yeah, they ask, how have you considered how we move towards decolonizing the plan drawing master plan? Could you speak towards other modes of representation as offering a more democratic response? And I'm not a planner, so I don't really think in terms of the grid, right? That colonial grid in terms of the city and how and what does that uphold? So I haven't really put too much thought into that. But your second question I have in terms of other modes of representation as offering more democratic response, I find it the conversation in Puerto Rico is always about conservation and preservation, right? And there is seldom a questioning and a critique of why is this worth preserving and conserving. And that is the conversation that I am interested in having. And then through that conversation is also how can we develop a more participatory culture of memory and of commemoration where communities themselves, not the mayor, decide who we remember, who we honor, and who we decide to celebrate in our communities. And finally, also pushing beyond the anthropocentric obsession we have with the human body of always celebrating man, woman, and as sort of the beacon or symbol of everything that we can achieve. And I think there's other forms of life that we can also consider as sort of democratizing this process.
Could you also speak to sort of the lack of representation of Black monuments in the map? And somebody had asked why there was considerably less than other.
Yeah, well, that part of that reason is also this is a mapping process, right? We're still working on it, but there is visibly less to Blackness than Indigenous. And that is partly because of the perceived erasure and inexistence of Indigenous peoples, the perceived And because of that, indigenous peoples are much more celebrated as folkloric sort of beings, while Blackness is very much present and very much still in your face. And there's still, there's the racial democracy that in place in Puerto Rico, and you will find monuments to Blackness, but unfortunately they are usually part of a monument to mestizaje, a monument to the mixture of races. But in the map, you can find some excellent portrayals of Blackness that are found in Puerto Rico. There's one in Caguas, which is very beautiful, called Osain, which has a mangrove as its pedestal. And there's also we also have to remember that a lot of people who are Black and mulatto in Puerto Rico are commemorated, but they're not commemorated because they're Black or mulatto or anything. They're commemorated because they were important people in our society, right? Musicians and athletes and politicians and everything else.
Yeah, definitely. I'm gonna add two more questions. They're both for Maritza. I did see there's a question about how can individuals help spread the awareness? Should we learn how to apply information on the maps to then teach our communities to share more knowledge? I'm just gonna, I think having panels like this is part of it. I think ever more we encounter maps in our day-to-day life, in social media, in Puerto Rico, there's always like some map that goes viral in Facebook or something like that. I remember there's always one that keeps coming back. I can't remember exactly what it was about. But in social media and news outlets, we continue to interact with maps. So there is an objective to a degree that for us to continue to use them to communicate information. I think from the general public, in interacting with them continuously, because you will come to terms with sort of like what's in it. In how do communities leverage it? It's a broader conversation. In Puerto Rico, there's a lot of effort in that leverage maps to sort of display what their activism, how they're organizing. I can't really think of examples off the top of my head. Right now I'm really thinking of a map by Todas PR that sort of, like, I think a couple of years ago highlighted like feminicides in Puerto Rico. So all that type of thing, efforts are really a part of what we're trying to do here and talk about, and how do we share information and how we put in perspective stuff that might not be overtly visible when we only see them through in numbers or in written text. But there's two questions for Maritza. One is if you use data from the 100-year floods, or I'm guessing, or that you use the 500-year floods for your estimates. I'm guessing this is related to the population in the coast. You're on mute. Sorry.
Ahora, sí, esa pregunta, y creo que también hay otra pregunta, estaba
Sí.
mirando, o sea, relacionada a esa. Nosotros en los mapas mayormente lo que nos enfocamos fue en identificar la erosión costera y cambios costeros. Pero la ventaja, basado en las preguntas, nosotros no usamos esos mapas para generar el web map como tal, pero sí podemos upload, ¿verdad? Montar esas capas, ya sea la capa de inundación de FEMA, la oficial, o la que definió la Junta de Planificación en el 2018, que también se llama, que se usa para identificación de, por ejemplo, manejo costero y manejo general de la isla. Ahí realmente pueden utilizar, si ustedes van al web map de los QR codes que dejé cuando dejé la presentación, ustedes pueden entonces ir al mapa, y si tienen esas capas, pueden entonces subirla y pueden hacer el análisis. Nosotros en la universidad utilizamos diversos mapas, hasta capas que generamos o capas que nos mandan a generar las mismas comunidades, y podemos hacer realmente, hay diversos análisis que realmente se pueden hacer.
I remember my work with using these as such headaches.
Sí.
But I really do like Maritza's work. I got the chance to read a lot of it when I was doing my bachelor's in Mayagüez, and it's really worth reading if you're interested in understanding the state of the beaches in Puerto Rico. I think that's one of the titles of Estado de la Costa de Puerto Rico. It's really worth a read. It's very interesting stuff, and it really put in perspective not only the effects that Hurricane Maria had on the coast, but the continuous or historical trend that beaches in Puerto Rico has had towards erosion and different patterns and all that. When we see now new ads for developments in, I don't know, Joyudas in Cabo Rojo or others, it's like, how the hell are you gonna do this if here it says that that sliver of beach is gonna disappear if the trend continues. But nevertheless, thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you very much to the audience for being here. This has been a great time. I really appreciate having this conversation. I think the audience also did. So, and it's thank you all for being here, taking time to participate in this. And to the audience, please continue using maps. They're very cool. Bye.